Okay, the main claim of fact that I am arguing today is that factory farming has significant negative consequences on society. Factory farming is defined as a system of rearing livestock using intensive methods by which poultry, cattle, or pigs are confined indoors under strictly controlled conditions. In other words, a factory farm is a large industrialized farm on which substantial numbers of livestock are raised in conditions intended to maximize production at minimal cost. The secondary claims that support my main claim include: number 1, factory farming is causing severe environmental effects. Number 2, factory farming threatens human health through the contamination of the food process. And number 3, the implementation of factory farming negatively affects the economy of farming regions. My first supporting claim, factory farming is causing severe environmental effects, discusses how these industrialized farms have been harming the land surrounding them as well as the communities nearby. The USDA has reported that animals contained within factory farms produce 61 million tons of waste each year. This is 130 times the volume of waste that humans produce. The confinement of such a large number of animals in one place produces much more waste than the surrounding land can handle. Factory farms store the waste that their animals have produced in large manure pits or lagoons, which they ultimately apply to farm fields as fertilizer. The problem with this method of storage is that farmers over-apply manure to their fields, exceeding the soil's ability to incorporate it, resulting in the manure and other waste seeping into the local streams and groundwater. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, hog, chicken, and cattle waste has polluted 35,000 miles of rivers in 22 states and contaminated groundwater in 17 states. Another problem with this method is that manure lagoons leak, which can lead to residential drinking wells being contaminated with dangerous bacteria, and the runoff of these lagoons can damage the ecological balance of streams and rivers. The State Journal Register of Illinois reported that in 2011, a hog farm spilled over 200,000 tons of manure and contaminated the nearby streams and killed over 110,000 fish. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has stated that chemical and infectious compounds from swine and poultry waste are able to migrate into soil and water. This untreated waste often sickens the people who work or live nearby these factory farms. With all that said, large quantities of decomposing manure doesn't just stink, it can be a health hazard as well. The noxious gases emitted from manure lagoons, including hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and methane, can harm the health of those living and working nearby. Large hog farms emit hydrogen sulfide, a gas that in most cases causes humans to have flu-like symptoms. In 1998, the National Institute of Health reported that 19 people died as a result of hydrogen sulfide emissions from manure pits. Other cases have been reported and documented of people experiencing skin rashes and breathing problems as a result of working on factory farms. A study done by Michael Greger, MD, and Gary Kanasuran in 2010 found that at least 25% of factory farm workers had documented and reported respiratory problems as a result of their job. The emission of harmful gases, the spread of animal manure into streams and groundwater, and the contamination of drinking water are not the only way that factory farms are harmful to human beings. Other ways that factory farms are hazardous to human health can be explained in my second supporting claim: factory farming threatens human health through the contamination of the food process. There are 50 million pounds of antibiotics produced in the US each year. 80% of those antibiotics are used on livestock to merely promote rapid growth. This creates a breeding ground for the antibiotic-resistant bacteria within the animals, which causes the antibiotics used on millions of factory farm livestock to reduce the effectiveness of antibiotics for human patients. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria are bacteria that have adapted to the point where antibiotics are no longer an effective way to kill them. The Center for Disease Control has estimated that 2 million illnesses come from an antibiotic-resistant infection every year caused by the overuse of antibiotics on livestock. A study done by Dr. Stuart B. Levy examined the effect of chlorotetracycline, a common antibiotic found in feed, on the intestines of chickens. Using a controlled experimental design, chickens were divided into two groups. The experimental group received feed that contained antibiotics. The control group received feed that did not contain drugs. After 2 weeks, 90% of the experimental chickens excreted 100% antibiotic-resistant organisms. This means that the chickens that were given the antibiotics created bacteria in their intestines that were antibiotic-resistant. For us humans, that means if we ingest animals that have created antibiotic-resistant organisms, specific antibiotics would be rendered ineffective, making us more vulnerable to previously treatable diseases. Dr. Margaret Chan, the General Director of the World Health Organization, released a statement on World Health Day in 2011, stating that in the absence of urgent corrective and protective actions, the world is headed toward a post-antibiotic era, in which many common infections will no longer have a cure or once again kill. Ultimately, if factory farms do not choose to minimize their use of antibiotics, our ability to fight common diseases could potentially deteriorate. Moving on to my last claim, the third supporting claim, is that factory farming negatively affects the economy of farming regions. Within the last several decades, the economics of the food system have changed dramatically. Millions of farms have gone out of business as government policy has encouraged larger, more intensive farm operations, such as the factory farm model. The people who advocate for industrialized farming claim that it is the most efficient way to produce cheap food for the world, but they fail to explain that the low cost of food does not take into account the true cost of production. Some of these hidden costs include degradation of our water, soil, and air, damage to our health, and many other impacts felt by the communities in which these industrial facilities are located. None of these costs are paid for by the owners of the factory farms, but rather by the people who live in the rural communities surrounding them. And the profits made by each farm are shared amongst investors instead of being reinvested into the farming economy. Another negative effect that factory farming has on the communities surrounding the property, as well as the economy, is that the property value of homes in close proximity to these farms has substantially declined. A study conducted by the Humane Society of the United States claims that in 5 counties in north central Iowa, they found that nearby residents downwind of a confinement operation, a factory farm, suffered a 10% drop in property value. Thus, residents of the community have suffered economic harm and for the financial benefit of the company. They have suffered economic harm for the financial benefit of the company. And with all that said, factory farms may produce a larger output per worker than small sustainable farms, but it is at the expense of the economy and the community. I believe I've given you enough evidence in my speech to agree that factory farming has significant negative consequences on society.
Oh boy, manure pits 2 times in a row. We got the proposition clearly stated. There's a layout of the structure, that's fine. The definition that you give at the beginning is good. You signpost the supporting claims as you go through them. You also have good transitions between those points. On a couple of things, I think you could use a little bit more time. In fact, I would think it might be better for you to pick one of these issues to use to talk about instead of trying to cover all the issues, because I think you end up not developing it as strongly as you might have otherwise. For instance, the whole issue about the health points, the best information that you had that was most clearly linked to environmental dangers were the 19 deaths that were associated with the manure problems that you talked about. But how those resulted and the context and the time period, for instance, I think needs to be covered in more detail, because I don't know if those dangers come from people developing an illness, for instance, or if there's some industrial accident that I don't even want to think about that's part of what happens there. That needed to be explained a little bit more. The respiratory issue, you did have a nice statistic on that for the employees that suggested that 1/4 of them have respiratory issues that you think are directly attributable to that. I thought that to me seems like the place where there's beginning to be developed a pretty solid argument. You've got some good information on that. The environmental issue, we're getting the highlights here as opposed to any details on it. The third point to me seems like, except for the property value issue that you mentioned right at the very end, everything else in that point is basically a recap of what you had on the first and the second point. And then you get to the issue about the home prices dropping. I guess it's primarily because they're downwind, and who wants to live downwind from the pig manure factory? I don't know that's a big deal, but I think one of the things that you would need to demonstrate is that problem has come about after people lived in those places, because it's one of those things. If it's gotten worse since then, that's what you need to be able to illustrate. If that's the way it was when they moved in and home prices are lower as a consequence of that, well, that's just the consequence of choosing that. Maybe that's why you bought the house there in the first place. So you need to show that they're coming in and decreasing the home prices from what they once were, as opposed to simply comparing them to surrounding neighborhoods. All right. Thank you.